Good morning, Shavua Tov. Welcome. This week is the Parsha of Chayei. This week's Parsha, after the passing of Sarah, we learn about the first Shidduch that is explicitly discussed in the Torah. Of course, the first Shidduch in history was that of Adam and Chava, but that is spoken about in the Medrash, perhaps alluded to in the Torah. But in this week's Parsha, we learn about the first pair, the first matchmaking that Avram arranges through his servant Eliezer to marry off his son Yitzchak, who at that time, he was already 40 years old. It was time for him to get married. And the Torah discusses at great length the whole process, how this Shidduch came about. Avram tells Eliezer that he doesn't want his future daughter-in-law, the wife of Yitzchak, to come from the land of Canaan where they were living at that time. And he told him, you should go to my birthplace. Go to Haran. It is there you will find the Shidduch. And we learn about the miraculous story, how exactly Eliezer, he, with Kfitzas Haderech, in an extraordinarily miraculous way, a journey of 17 days, took but one day to arrive, and he davens to Hashem, saying that he is going to make a sign who is going to be the right one. And if that sign comes to be, then he will know this is the right one. And even before he concludes his prayer, already Rivka emerges with the jug on her shoulder, and he is very, very impressed how she gives water to him, to his camels. Before she takes for herself, he sees extraordinary chesed, and ultimately, she is the right one. Now, we know that when it comes to shidduchim, when it comes to matchmaking, of course, everybody has their special match. There's the word Bashert we're very familiar with, which means everyone has a Shidduch. Everyone has a spouse who is destined, preordained for them. As the saying goes, every pot has its cover. Now, here in this story, though, we see a certain urgency, a certain urge for the Shidduch to be effected without any delay. Avram tells Eliezer, you need to go right away. There's the Kfitzas Haderech. All of this, there's an urgency for Yitzchak's Shidduch to be put together without any delay. And the question is, what we're going to explore today about this concept of matchmaking. Is this something that indeed is divinely ordained, decreed in the heavens? Or is this something that we choose? Every person has free choice. Everyone has the Bechira Chavshis. It is a cornerstone in religious and Jewish faith, that every person has the ability to make a choice in life that is not tampered with, that is not in any way tainted. So, in this case, if Yitzchak could have theoretically married anyone, so then we understand that there's a shidduch that has to be taken place, and Eliezer sent to go find the right one, someone who would be compatible with him. If the shidduch is already decreed in heaven, it's hard to understand what's the difference when he gets married, why there would have to be the kfitzas haderech, why this miracle would have to happen. Because if it's divinely ordained, then nothing could in any way nothing could undermine it, nothing could frustrate it. It's something that would be inevitable. The truth is, when we study this, the Talmudic sources, it's a discussion. In the Talmud in Sota, right in the beginning, it says, we know the famous statement that 40 days before the fetus fetus is formed, there is a bas kol, there's a heavenly voice that rings out and says, Bas Ploni Leploni, this person will marry this person. It seems very clear that the Shidduch is a divine decree. It's predestined. On the other hand, the Talmud discusses that perhaps over there's a distinction between the first marriage and the second marriage, whereby the second one could be based on a person's merits. And we do see other sources that talk about that the Shidduch is based on the merits of a person, on their action, their initiative. Further, we see from this week's Parsha, the Talmud in Moed Katan tells us that the Shidduch comes from Hashem. We find later in the story where Eliezer presents his whole story to Lavan and Besuel about how he miraculously discovers the Shidduch. He finds Rivka and he says this whole way how I'm praying and then she shows up. It was all meant to be. And Besuel, he says, Me Hashem yatsa davar. This matter has come from Hashem. And the Talmud in Moed Katan tells us that this is a source from this week's parsha that teaches us that the Shidduch it's baked in heaven. It's already decided there. So, on the one hand, it seems that is the case. But on the other hand, the Talmud tells us that it's not so simple, because we know that on Yom Tif, and as well on Chol HaMoed, it is forbidden to get married. We don't mix one on Chol HaMoed. We don't ein ma'arvin simcha b'simcha. We don't mix one simcha with another simcha. However, it is permitted to betroth, to get engaged on Chol HaMoed. The Talmud says because perhaps someone else, if you don't clinch the deal, someone else could come and preempt you. So it seems that it is possible sometimes for a Shidduch to be the one that you're destined to be with. It's not necessarily the case. So the truth is, there's a letter from the Rebbe where he discusses this whole idea at great length, and there are many sources and interpretations, different opinions. Generally, the Kabbalistic teachings advocate subscribe to the opinion that the whole Shidduch is min hashamayim. It's heavenly decreed. The more philosophically bent opinions, they subscribe to the notion that there's bechira chavshis, that there's freedom of choice. But we have to explore this today. What exactly is the proper perspective, and how that will influence how we look at our lives on a day-to-day basis. What's interesting, before we get to that, is the test that Eliezer makes, and what exactly Avram, through Eliezer, what kind of Shidduch they're looking for Yitzchak. So Avram clearly tells Eliezer that he does not want the Shidduch to be he doesn't want a girl from the land of Canaan where they're living. He wants from Haran. He wants an out-of-towner. Now, perhaps you could say that the land of Canaan was filled with idol worship. They did not subscribe to the view of Avram of a ethical and monotheistic God. But the problem with that is that in the land of Haran, where ultimately Eliezer lands up, and he's looking for a shidduch for Yitzchak. In Lavan's house, there's also idol worship. Lavan tells Eliezer, "Why are you standing outside? I have cleaned out and cleared out the house." And Rashi tells us because the house was full of idols. So why is the land of Haran, why is the house of Haran any better? The upbringing that Rivka would have with idols, why would that be any better than the land of Canaan? And one explanation that's given, the Kli Yakar famously says that there's a difference between idol worship and character, bad character. Meaning, idol worship is a mistaken and flawed view of a person and their world outlook and their belief system. But it's something that's in their mind. It's something that of an ideology. That is something that, number one, could be remedied. And further, the way it transmits to the next generation the children don't necessarily continue with the views of their parents. It's not something that is genetically or hereditarily transmitted from one generation to the next. However, when it comes to character, the character that a parent has often is passed on to their children. We see this in the story of the Torah itself. Avram knew the story of his life. He grew up in the house of Terach, his father, who had idols. He actually had a store where he sold idols. And yet Avram himself became a Baal Tshuva at a very young age and was the first to recognize Hashem and to disseminate the consciousness and the understanding of Hashem Echad. So ultimately, his father's views did not in any way impact the way he saw the world in a negative way. However, if we look at character, we look in the story of Cham, the son of Noach. So it tells us, the Medrash tells us that when the family of Noach and his children, when they were in the Teva, so the world was in a state of pain and sorrow and anguish. Cham was the only one who had relations inside the Teva. The fact that he was so apathetic to the state of affairs in the world that he was looked at very negatively. And we see that this insensitive and cruel attitude transmitted to his children. His son was Canaan. And we know that in the aftermath of the Teva, Noach gets drunk and he exposes himself. And Rashi tells us who's the one that told Cham and others about this. It was Canaan. Canaan tells his father Cham about the fact that his father's exposed, and they go and they tell their siblings. And when Noach comes to, he curses Cham and his descendants. Orur, they will be cursed. So, and the Talmud in Pesachim tells us that Canaan commanded 5 things to his children about the fact that they were destined to be slaves. And from the things that he tells them is love gezel v'zima. You should love theft and immorality. So the character of Cham we see transmitted to his children. And we see throughout the Torah many times that there's a major distinction between attitudes, perspectives, as opposed to character traits. We see right away at the beginning of creation, there were 2 generations. There was the Dor HaMabel, and there's the Dor HaFlaga. There's the generation of the flood, there's the generation of the dispersion. The generation of the flood were totally annihilated and destroyed. The Dor HaFlaga, they rebelled against Hashem, but they were not destroyed, they were merely dispersed. The Dor HaMabel were known to be evil people, corrupt people. As Rashi tells us that from the Talmud, that their fate was sealed because they would steal from each other, behave unethically, as opposed to the generation of the dispersion, the generation of Aflaga. Yes, they rebelled against Hashem. It was an intellectual rebellion, and therefore there was no need for them to be destroyed. They could live. They just had to be taken apart, separated from each other, because it was in their unity that they were able to advance their mistaken ideology. We find when it comes to Eliezer wanted to marry. Eliezer had a daughter. When Avram was telling Eliezer, I'm looking for a Shidduch, a nice girl for my son, Eliezer's thinking to himself, why am I schlepping 17-day journey all the way to Haran? I have a daughter, and my daughter should be able to marry Yitzchak. And Avram tells him, no, it's not going to happen, because we are Baruch, we are blessed. We come from we're descendants of Shem, and Shem was blessed. you are a descendant of Canaan who is cursed. Cursed and blessed, Arur and Baruch, are not a good Shidduch, are not compatible. So ultimately, Avram did not want to make the Shidduch with someone who had that flaw in their gene. Even though Eliezer himself was the Rashi brings that he was Dola Omashke Mitoris Rabbi Lacherim, he was a Rosh Yeshiva of sorts. He was someone who would disseminate the teachings. He wasn't just a servant, a butler of Avram. He was able to spread the teachings of Avram. And yet, since he was Avram was afraid that the negative character would manifest itself in his grandchildren. We see as well in the nations of the world, there was the nation of Amalek, and there's the nation of Ammon and Moab. Amalek was rebelled against the Jewish people, as the sages say, Yodeas Ribono Umschaven Liberbo. There's an ideological, intellectual attack against Hashem and the Jewish people. And yet, it says that Haman was a descendant of Amalek, and the Talmud tells us that ultimately, Haman's descendants, they did Shuvah. They were able to integrate into the Jewish community. Bnei Banav Lamdu Torah b'Bnei Brak. They studied Torah in the yeshiva halls of Bnei Brak. However, Ammon and Moab, the Torah says, Lo yavayu b'kal Hashem. They are not allowed to marry in to the community. Why? Because when the Jewish people were on their way to Eretz Yisrael, they did not offer us any food or bread or water. That's a particularly cruel and vicious midah, character trait. So from all of this, we see that indeed there is a distinction between an intellectual flaw and a character trait, which a character trait is far more difficult to eradicate, and it's something that indeed would transmit from parent to child. And thus Avram is telling Eliezer, yes, in Haran they have their challenges, they have misguided views, but those can be remedied. That's something that will not transmit genetically from Lavan and Besuel to Rivka. However, here in Canaan, this is something that I cannot countenance, and therefore, clearly the Torah is teaching us, and we see in the test of Eliezer, that it is what we look for is not just the most intelligent and savvy person in a shidduch. It is very much the character of the person. No matter how learned they are, if they have good midas, if they are willing to, the word we call is mevater, someone that is able to forego on their own wants and wishes, they suspend their ego and make way for another person and what they want, looking out for trying to enhance someone else's life. That is ultimately what you look in a shidduch. And when Eliezer sees that in Rivka, he is right away taken by her. And the rest is history. So back to the question, if Avram knows that, he believes that there's a Bashert, he knows that there is a girl out there that is destined for his son Yitzchak, we see he's moving every mountain. And our tradition tells us that Avram, in order to sweeten the pot, he gave away all of his possessions, all of his riches. He wrote a document which he gave to Eliezer, saying that all of my resources, all of my assets are given to Yitzchak, which would entice the prospective shidduch. And Eliezer, here he goes off on the 17-day journey, which takes only a day to be able to finalize the transaction. So what is the rush? And if you think about it, another interesting facet to the story is Rivka herself. Our tradition tells us that Rivka at this point is the grand old age of 3 years old. We learn how Yitzchak, after his Akedah, he was 37, and Avram is beginning to think about the fact that he has to make a shidduch, and at that point, Rivka was born. and it's with we know that the Torah tells us when Yitzchak was 40, he marries Yitzchak, and therefore it was at such a young age, which is quite astonishing. The fact that the Torah tells us that here she comes to the well with jugs on her shoulder, and she's drawing an enormous quantity of water, many gallons, and clearly in those days, and the Medrash tells us that 3 years old in those days they had an advanced maturity, and therefore when we talk about a person who is 3 years old, it's not the 3 years old of today. We even see later in the story when they want to decide they're deliberating, should the shidduch happen or not, they say, let's ask her opinion. Today we don't ask 3-year-olds about what their opinion is, but certainly in those days that was the nature. Clearly the body development and the maturity of those days was far more advanced than it is now. But what is the idea? Why is Rivka getting married at such a young age, at 3, and we have to right away marry her and take her back to Canaan? This clearly indicates that there's a certain urgency. There is a timeline over here, and it can no longer wait. The Rebbe once explained, on one level, that, as we mentioned before, that Avram wrote a shtar, he wrote a document transferring all of his assets to Yitzchak. And therefore, since he did not, the Talmud tells us a person should not give away all their assets before the time has come, and therefore he didn't want to give it all away at an earlier time. However, if he would write the document before Eliezer goes, and it takes 17 days to go, he can't give it away that day, and he doesn't want to give a post-dated shtar, a shtar me'ucher, as the Talmud calls it, because that's also something that looks suspicious. And therefore, there was a necessity for a miracle. That's that's like a legalistic explanation. But the Rebbe also explains this idea on a more spiritual and sublime level. And the crux of what the Shidduch really is all about, and how this Shidduch could really, although it's decreed in heaven, sometimes our actions, our efforts can really change things up. There is a story of the Maggid of Mizrich. Once there was a young Bashert who was very, very poor, came to study by the Maggid for a little while, and after he concluded the time to study and to pray and to meditate, reflect, as he takes leave of the Maggid says, well, I see that you're of marriageable age. Why are you not married yet? And he says, listen, I have no money, and it's not really very, very appealing. Such a poor person, I'm having a very, very hard time. So the Maggid says, I want to give you a bracha to have a shidduch, and here's my advice. When you go out, the first proposition, the first opportunity, you should say yes right away. Okay, that's what he does. He goes out, and on his way back, he stops off at an inn. And as was the custom, for those who weren't of means, they couldn't afford a room with a bed, he sat down next to the furnace, the oven, to warm himself up. And sitting around there were a bunch of very, very, shall we say, not the most noble people of society. And they thought, oh, here's a little boy, let's have some fun. So they come over to him and they start poking him and prodding him and say, who are you? Where are you coming from? He said, well, I just came from the saintly rabbi, Reb Dov Ber, Maggid of Mizrich, and here I am. He says, what did you learn over there? We studied some Kabbalah, some mystical teachings, and he gave me some advice. He says, when you leave now, the first shidduch proposition that you receive, you should immediately accept. So now here they go, we could have some fun over here. One of them says, I have a sister over here who would be a perfect shidduch for you. She has a little dowry. Let's make a shidduch right now. This person actually wasn't related to anybody. He was just playing a game. It was some kind of prank, and he goes over to, at that time the innkeeper was out, wasn't around, but his daughter was there, and he says, I have a great idea for you. There's this little boy over here. We're going to make a shidduch. We're going to make an engagement party, and it's going to be good for business. You'll get some people are going to be buying whiskey. They're going to buy some food. We're going to have a party. Just play along with us. And she says, okay, no problem. And that's how it was. L'chaim, Mazel Tov, and they start bringing the whiskey starts flowing, and it's lebedik, it's fun. And they say, we just made the shidduch. Why don't we actually get married? Why don't we make a chasana? And we're really going to have some drinks. We're really going to have some good food. But they said, hang on, we don't know how to write a ksuba, to make the marriage contract. We don't know how to do anything. So this boy over here, call him Mayor, he says, don't worry, I'm a learned scholar. I could write the ksuba, I could write it all up. And so he goes ahead and he writes up the ksuba. They take a tablecloth with 4 broomsticks, and they make the chuppah, and they start singing and dancing, and he gives her the ksuba, and he betroths her, and it's a chasana, and they're dancing and shikering. But slowly things start to devolve and degenerate. They start pushing him and poking him and harassing him, and he runs away and sleeps off in some place, in some tavern somewhere. He had to run away because it was getting too rowdy for him. And that's it. He wakes up the next morning and he wants to come back to the inn. He has his wife, his newly minted wife, his shver, his father-in-law, but he's a little bit anxious, he's nervous. And all of a sudden, he's standing near the inn, and he hears some of the chevra over there say, here comes the new father-in-law, Mazel Tov, Shalom Aleichem, and the man over there, the father of this daughter, says, what are you guys talking about? What are you saying? He says, we had such a good time last night. We made, your daughter got engaged and got married, and there was food and there was drinks. It was amazing. And now he's really concerned. He goes over to his daughter and he says, what's going on? He says, yes, indeed, that's what happened. You weren't around, but we had some good times, and we sold so much, we made so much money last night. It was a lot of fun. But now he starts asking, hang on a second, what's going on? And the man walks in and he says, yes, Shalom Aleichem, my father-in-law, how are you, Mayor? So he says, and he starts investigating, and indeed, they wrote a ksuba. Things were actually done halachically and legally. His daughter was legally married. Now he's getting really nervous. He starts shouting at him, and he slaps him. How dare you do this? Make this prank on my daughter? But then he realized this guy is really he's not taking the right approach. If he really wants him to back off, he should be nicer to him. So he changes his demeanor, smiles at him, and he says, "Listen, we all understand there was a misunderstanding. Why don't we do it like this? Why don't you? Here I have 20 silver rubles. You will give my daughter a bill of divorce and call it a day." He says, "Listen, no, I'm sorry, I can't." Now he's shocked. This is a poor person. 20 silver rubles, not a small matter. Slowly he's upping the amount more and more, but this guy's not budging. So he says, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, I listened to my teacher. My teacher told me that the first shidduch that you encounter, you should take it, and that's what I followed. If you have a problem with this advice, let's go to my teacher, the Maggid, and let's have it out with him." So he agrees, and they go to the Maggid of Mizrich, and this innkeeper, the father of the bride, he starts telling the Maggid, "I don't understand. I leave for a few minutes. I come back. My daughter's married. There's chaos going on." And he says, "It's on your advice. Could you please fix the situation?" He says, "Let me speak to him." He calls him in and he says, "Tell me, is everything what he said true?" He said, "Yes, but I followed your advice. I took the first shidduch, and that's what it is." And the Maggid said, "You really want to marry her?" He says, "Yes, 100%. So the Maggid calls in the father-in-law and he says, "I suggest that if you give this son-in-law 1,000 silver rubles, perhaps I could fix the whole situation. But I want to tell you that I have an idea for you. I know your daughter, she's of marriageable age. I know somebody amazing, an amazing shidduch, and I think it would be very, very good for your daughter. So this innkeeper says, listen, Rabbi, I trust you. If you think you have a great shidduch, I'm all open ears. Yes, he is of fine, sterling character, a Talmud Chacham, a wise scholar, and he is just perfect. He only has one issue. One issue is he is very, very poor, comes from a poor family, but even that we've already taken care of because his to-be father-in-law has already given him 1,000 silver coins. The innkeeper thinks about it, and he's starting to look at his son-in-law differently, and he says, you know what? I hear you. I think we should continue. Let's go ahead with this. And indeed, they lived for many, many years in happiness and health and prosperity. This is one of the classic stories we hear about Shidduchim. And the truth is, we see from the story there's clearly two components over here. Number one, and this is the idea that's spoken about in Kabbalah, that in truth, marriage is all about the fact that there is one neshama, there's one soul, that before coming down into this world is split into two. And it is the task from every person, they need to seek out the other half of their soul. And through the marriage, it's not just the union, but it's the reunion of the soul. And this is something that is decreed in heaven. This is something that is Bashert. However, on the other hand, you need to be able to make some kind of effort. It's not something that will happen on its own. So on the one hand, when we talk about Bashert, there's a famous medrash, attributed medrash to about Shlomo HaMelech and his daughter. Shlomo was once heard from the stargazers and the astrologers that his daughter was destined to marry a abjectly poor, impoverished person. And Shlomo HaMelech, according to one source, wasn't against that, but he wanted to prove a point. And so he takes his daughter to a faraway land and puts her in this huge tower, this castle, and it's guarded by many, many guards. So it was something that could not be easily penetrated. And there, his daughter's there, all alone. No one could approach her. But one day, there was this fellow who was traveling out in the desert, and this poor person with nothing, and he was famished and starving and was looking for a place to sleep, and he lays down in the carcass of an animal that he finds there on the ground. And as he's sleeping, this eagle comes and picks up the carcass and flies with it all the way and lands on the roof of this tower in this faraway land where Shlomo HaMelech's daughter was housed. And she wakes up one morning and she looks out and she sees there's this huge carcass of an animal there, and she goes out there and she sees that there's a person in there, and she pulls him out, and he's not well, and she brings him inside, and they nurse him back to health, and they give him royal clothes to wear, and she's very, very impressed with him. As she speaks to him, she realizes he's actually a very fine person, a very knowledgeable and educated person, and she proposes, says, will you marry me? And he agrees, and then Shlomo HaMelech hears about it, and he says, you see, if something is determined, decreed in heaven, it's something that will ultimately happen. But that, on the one hand, clearly shows that there is a destiny, there is something that is Bashert. But here is the key, that at the end of the day, Hashem wants our hishtadlus. He wants that we should make our effort, put in our initiative. Because the way Hashem designed this world, the way He created it is such that ultimately He wants us to be partners. He doesn't want that we should just be passive bystanders and just watch this movie of creation. He wants that each and every one of us should be active participants. And indeed, we don't want to feel that everything that we receive in life is something that is just there by chance, and everything we do is just a handout by Hashem. We want to feel that the things that we have, we put into it, we created, We contributed to it. And therefore Hashem designed the world that our actions matter and could alter the course of the way things turn out. And therefore, at the end of the day, there is something called Bashert, but our actions can actually change the course of our lives. How could that happen? The Talmud tells us in Moed Katan, in that Talmud we mentioned before, that through a person's prayers, betfila, rachamim, through advocating and insisting, if a person truly wants something, they could actually change as to what their shidduch will be. If you don't do anything, a person could be destined for a particular person, but they don't act on it. They're lazy, they procrastinate. What could happen is someone else can actually preempt them and marry them. Or maybe that person won't marry at all. Meaning, as the Rebbe says, we see from the fact that the Talmud says you can get married, or rather you could be engaged on Chol HaMoed because there's a concern someone else will preempt you. This clearly indicates that there is clearly a human component. There is an input that we all have, and we can actually change the course. Now, in this itself, there are many, many opinions. Some say that if a person truly, truly prays, then they could actually change and annul the decree entirely. They could marry somebody else. Other opinions say no, it's merely a temporary thing. You could, through your prayers, temporarily marry someone you're not destined for, or who was destined for somebody else. But ultimately, it will end up in not sustaining itself, whether it ends in divorce or, God forbid, the person passes and so on. We see in the story of David and Bathsheba, the Talmud tells us in Sanhedrin that David and Bathsheba were destined for each other from Sheishis Yimei Bereshis. From the day the world was created, they were destined for each other. But something must have happened. Maybe David didn't take initiative. He procrastinated. Maybe Uriah, Bathsheba's first husband, maybe he prayed, and therefore he married her first. But ultimately, in that whole story, they were meant for each other. But how do we see this? Where do we see this, that we can really change the course and alter the direction of our lives? We look in the Torah. We look at Yaakov, who married Rachel and Leah. We know that Rachel was supposed to marry Yaakov, and Esav was supposed to marry Leah. As it says, there was the two brothers, there was the older and the younger, and there were the two sisters, Hagdola v'Aktana. The older was supposed to marry the older one, the younger was supposed to marry the younger brother. And she wasn't very, very keen on that. As we know, the Torah says her eyes were soft, she was constantly crying. And she prayed and she prayed. And what happened in the end? In the end, through all of her insistence and prayers and storming the heavens, she ultimately was able to radically change the course of her lives. Instead of living with Esav, the Rasha, the wicked man, the murderer, the thief, she lands up with everything. She marries Yaakov. And most of the tribes are born through her. The Bachor, the firstborn, Ruvain, the monarchy, Yehuda, the priesthood, Levi, Torah scholarship, all of her children in each way began empires and dynasties. The majority were through her. Rachel, in the end, it's temporary. Yosef, and most of all, Leah, she is buried with Yaakov. She is buried next to him for thousands of years. Rachel lands up out there in Beis Lechem. And so she totally changed the course of her life because she didn't settle for the status quo. She said, you know what? Now, we could debate as to whether she should have married Esav or not. We're not going to get into that discussion. But the idea that when a person prays for something and they really mean it, it could totally change. And this is why this is true. We're talking about the discussion today is the Shidduchim, but it extends itself to all areas of life. That at the end of the day, when we see something happening in our lives and we are frustrated or we are disappointed, we should remember that we should never give up, because through our prayers, if we truly mean it and we advocate and petition Hashem, even something that was decreed in heaven, we are not fixed and locked into any situation. We can ultimately change it. And I'm just thinking today, because we know just yesterday we learned about the passing of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he would always talk about his encounter with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, when he came as a young student in Cambridge, and he comes to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, "What are you doing?" He thought he was going to ask the Rebbe questions, and the Rebbe asks him, "What are you doing for Jewish life on campus?" And he says, "Rebbe, in the circumstance that I find myself." And right away the Rebbe cuts him off and says, "No Jew ever finds themselves in a circumstance." My father-in-law, the Frierdiker Rebbe, says that at the end of the day, every circumstance you put yourself in. And if you put yourself in one circumstance, you could put yourself in another circumstance. And therefore, this is true. This is a very, very powerful idea that he would constantly talk about this. And it's very, very inspiring to know that in every situation, every circumstance where we are, it is through our collective power of prayer and davening and acts of goodness and kindness, we know that we can ultimately, we're never doomed, we are never set and destined to be anything. Yes, there are these decrees, gzeiras in heaven, but ultimately we are partners in creation, and we create our reality, we create our energy, and we will determine ultimately what happens to us. And therefore, to conclude, we know that Rivka, the Midrash says that Rivka was Keshoshana ben Hachochim. She was like a rose amongst the thorns. Here she is, such a beautiful, pious person, and she's surrounded with lavan, besuel, idolatry, and deceit. And therefore, the Rebbe says, this is the big reason why there was the Kfitzas HaDerech, the urgency, because until she turned 3, she wasn't ready to get married, she couldn't have children, she couldn't build the family. It was the second that she turned 3, she had to be taken out. And therefore, there's no delay. Eliezer cannot tarry, he can't just go on this excursion of 17 days to get it to make it to Haran. The day that she becomes available, she becomes eligible for marriage, she needs to be plucked right out, and she is brought miraculously to the family of Avram, Yitzchak, and they build their family. And the Rebbe says the truth is, we are also in Gullus today, like the lily amongst thorns. We are like this, here we are, the Jewish people, and we are surrounded by wolves, by thorns, by all these challenges that we're dealing with in this exile, in this Gullus that is dark and challenging, and the challenges grow from day to day. We should know that sometimes we look around and all this darkness, and there's no need to elaborate on the darkness and the challenges that we're dealing with today on every single level. And sometimes we just want to throw in the towel and give up and say, it's just a never-ending gullus, and what we have to deal with as a people, it's just too much to endure. And we just feel like giving up, we despair. But we should know, the Rebbe says, that just like Rivka, she had to endure those challenges, but the moment the time was ripe and the time was right, she was immediately lifted up and carried right to Eretz Yisrael. A journey that should take 17 days each way. Eliezer gets there in 1 day, he stays overnight, and he goes back the next day, a day and a half, boom, the whole thing is done. We should also know we're here in Gullus, and we are here for a reason we can't necessarily fathom. But ultimately, we should know that the time is imminent, and when the time does come, Hashem will not delay the Gullus. Keherifayin, as the Rebbe would often quote the Medrash, that Hashem will not wait even the blink of an eye. Even that smallest instant, Hashem will not delay the Gullus. And therefore we should not feel like we're just sitting around and waiting for something to happen. The moment that it comes, our Geula will arrive. And therefore each and every one of us, we daven and we beseech Hashem that Daloi Gullus, enough for the Gullus, enough that we're all dealing with. We should all hear Besuris Tovus, we should hear good news, each and every one of us, in our families, in our communities, and we should be Zoichet to the Gula Amitis Vashlema